Hello, and welcome to the Overcoming Podcast with your host, Adriana Lewin. Before we jump into today's episode, if you could please kindly subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram at _Adriana_Lewin. Hello, and welcome to today's podcast episode of the Overcoming Podcast. Today's guest, I'm excited to bring on Jessica Watterud. Jessica Watterud is a licensed professional clinical counselor, an EMDR therapist, and a functional blood work specialist specializing in trauma in North Dakota. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to chat with you because I'm just super curious about the work that you do. So before I dive into like where I'm super curious, I just want to kind of level the field here for everyone to make sure that if someone's tuning in, they understand what EMDR is, because it is a buzzword in communities now, but not a lot of people really know what it is still. So can you talk a little bit about what EMDR is? And yeah.
Yeah. So EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. So really what we're looking at, I'm going to simplify this a lot, but when we go through things in our life, and a lot of times it's very early on in life, we as children make a determination about that. So something happens when I'm 5 and I interpret that in my 5-year-old brain and what that means about me. And then that can really get stuck and carried on through life. So just to give an example, because examples are really helpful for me to understand something. So say there's something like I get left out of something, and the way that I interpret that in my little 5-year-old brain is that I'm not good enough. And then things happen in my life. Maybe I don't get a very good grade, or maybe my friend doesn't want to hang out with me, or maybe my boyfriend dumps me, or some things happen throughout life. And that gets dug deeper because I'm already interpreting life through that lens that I'm not good enough. And then so now I'm acting as if that is true about me. And maybe even trying to do things to prove that wrong. So then it becomes about, how do other people perceive me? And I'm trying to please people all the time. So there's a lot of ways that can go, but what we're really looking at is, what are those negative beliefs that a person began believing about themselves early on that are carrying through life? And we're going to go in and we're going to reprocess those memories. So the memory stays the same. We're just looking at it from a different angle.
There you go. And that is EMDR in a nutshell. I'm also EMDR trained and I love it. I primarily do that with my clients now that visit with me, because I focus on trauma in my practice. And yes, those negative beliefs that just they come up from an experience that you have as a child, or even later on, those can happen too. But oftentimes, there are beliefs that we make about ourselves at such a young age that drive our behavior or lack of behaviors. So, so that's EMDR therapy. And what exactly is functional blood work specialist?
So what I do is take the normal blood work that people get when they go to their doctor, maybe for their yearly physical, get their blood work, and look through it using functional medicine ranges. So those are a little bit different than traditional medicine ranges. But what we're trying to do is get, like, where is your body functioning at its optimal level, rather than just, you're not going to die if you're out of this range, right? So when medical ranges, they're like, we just want to keep you alive and functioning. Functional medicine, we're looking at how all the systems working together, and how do we keep them working together at an optimal level.
It's really fascinating. So what are the are you looking at like cholesterol and triglycerides and vitamin D? Like, what are the big ones that like cortisol? Like, for example, cortisol, right? That if being a trauma therapist,
Yes.
that's not on my typical doctor PCP blood work. He's not like, let me check your cortisol levels and make sure that you're doing great.
Hmm. Yeah. So we can kind of, I mean, we know as mental health providers that cortisol has a huge impact, right?
Mhm.
But we can look at other numbers and determine like the body is under stress. We don't necessarily need the cortisol level to say the body is under a lot of stress right now. So one of the ones that's pretty common, and I've known about this long before I was ever trained in reading blood work, but is the thyroid. So if your thyroid is off, you know, one of the things we need to rule out before diagnosing someone with depression is there a thyroid condition present? Because the
Mhm.
symptoms look the same.
Mhm.
So, I mean, same with anxiety. So, if your thyroid is off, you can be very anxious as well. So, that's a really common one is the thyroid. There's a test called the CBC with differential. So, the
Mhm.
differential portion is very, and that would give you, if you had your blood work in front of you, like the neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils. So those numbers are super important because what they'll tell you is there a low grade bacterial infection? Do you have an active virus? So if your body is trying to fight something, the energy is going towards whatever that is, and you don't have energy for other things. So then we have people, even mentally, if you think about when you have a cold, you feel more drained mentally as well.
Mhm.
Well, if you have a low grade virus going on and you're not aware of what it is, maybe we don't have a name for it, or like in my example, I was told you're a mom, you're going to be tired. Um,
Mhm.
then
Yeah.
going towards that thing and we don't know what it is. So that's a huge piece of what I'm looking at is that differential portion and what's the underlying cause that's throwing off the rest of the system.
That's fascinating. Because so so people know this about me, but basically, long story short, I went through loss about 5 years ago, and then about 4 years ago, my son was diagnosed with cancer.
Mm,
And within that year, like the amount of stress that I went through was through the charts, right? And as I started reading through The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, he talks about people with PTSD actually have low cortisol, right? And one of my doctors happened to run labs on me at some point shortly after that, for autoimmune stuff, just, keeping an eye on some stuff for me. And my cortisol was low, but not below the threshold. And he's like, it's fine. You're good. Like, I don't remember if it was like 6 is the cutoff. And I was like at 7.2 or something. I'm like, dang, that's really low. But to them, they're like, well, you're within normal range. So you're fine. So how, how do you, as a clinician, you're like, well, what if that's not my normal, right? Like, what if my normal is actually supposed to be a little bit higher and that would be more optimal? But those are all just for me, who is an untrained professional in that area. It's just like assumptions that I make, right? These theories that I have. So I'd love to hear your take on the difference between what the doctor, what you're getting at the doctor, and they're saying, hey, yeah, your triglycerides are fine, or your thyroid seems to be functioning fine because it's still within the normal limits. But what if that's not necessarily the best and optimal functioning for somebody?
right. Yeah. And a really common one is like vitamin D levels.
Oh, yeah.
So for vitamin D levels, the ranges for traditional medicine are 30 to 100. That is a huge range. So
Hmm.
30, mine was at 25, which is not that much below the range, but I was so exhausted, unbelievably exhausted. Well, optimally, we should be at around 80. And
Huh.
really, I function around 100. I feel better around there. So all of our bodies are different and our needs are different. And depending on the stresses in our life, um, how old we are, if there's autoimmune present or not, all of those things, our body is going to need to be at a different range. So when I work with clients on their blood work, I talk to them about where do you feel the best? Where are you performing the best? We're not really concerned about um, exactly where the number is supposed to be. There's a range for a reason, but where is it that you're actually feeling the best at?
Hmm. That's
And
really
that's your
interesting.
number.
So, do you start tackling one at a time and say, okay, well, I mean, I could show you, like, I literally just got my labs done a week ago, and oh my gosh, like,
Mhm.
let's just say I am meeting with a couple of specialists to make sure that I get my body back into a more optimal zone. But
Mhm.
vitamin D, that's always been low for me. And then I've got some, like the cortisol being low, like different little things here and there. How do you begin tackling and knowing, is it that we're taking enough vitamin D or do we need something else for the cortisol? Like when you start addressing all of them at once, I guess is my question. Like when you address it all at once, how do you know which one's working or not working? So do you have to go through and say, let's just increase vitamin D for the next few weeks and see how that works? And just what's that approach look like?
So what I would do is really look at the gut first, because ultimately the gut is like our center, right? So 80% of our immune system is in our gut. If the gut's messed up, everything's off. So a lot of the people that come to me, they're having gut issues already, maybe have for years. But even I'll use an example of somebody that I've been working with here. A lot of symptoms that would be maybe related more to depression, just a lot of fatigue, low motivation, um, trouble sleeping. And as I'm asking more questions, there are gut issues that have kind of been like, oh, it's just been my whole life. I've just felt like this forever. I don't really know what it's like not to feel that way. Um, but the cumulative effect of having these low level gut issues have added up to the thyroid is now off and hormones are out of balance. So I start with the gut. And everybody, I encourage everybody to be on vitamin D, especially like I'm in North Dakota. There is not enough sun here. Um, 4 months out of the year. So um, it's something like I'm probably going to get this number wrong, but something like 80 to 85% of the world is deficient in vitamin
Hmm.
D.
Yeah.
And the other piece of it is if your gut is unhealthy, you're not absorbing nutrients properly. So we can go in and we can heal the thyroid and we can, take care of the hormone imbalance and get everything in line, but it's just going to go out of whack again if the gut's not taken care of. So we start there. And then I see what else is going on. So if the thyroid is off, and not just looking at the thyroid, but the whole cascade, the pituitary talks to the thyroid talks to the adrenals. So we want to take care of all of those and make sure they're all functioning well. And the very last thing is getting to hormones. Um, all of those systems are impacting each other. But if I try to go directly to the hormones and I haven't taken care of an issue in the thyroid, hormones are going to get out of balance right away anyway.
That's interesting because, a lot of people talk about, especially as they get in their mid 30s and their early 40s, they're like, have you checked your hormones? Are you low on testosterone? And I think testosterone is the big one that I think of, like, because men, right?
Mhm.
Testosterone. And then they also check women for a certain level of testosterone for energy levels. So even if someone's testing low on there, it might just be still somewhat of a band-aid, essentially, right?
Right.
Like we're not going even deeper back to like who's in charge of the testosterone, essentially.
Yeah. So when we treat in isolation, we're not really taking care of, we're band-aiding everything. And it's the same with mental health. If all I look at is the symptoms that you're coming in with, and training EMDR, you know this. If I'm just
Mm-hmm.
care of these symptoms and okay, let's get your sleep on schedule and get you out and doing things outside. And this is how I practiced for a while. I was getting really frustrated. We're not taking care of that root cause. How are you really viewing yourself? And so if we're not getting to the root cause of what's happening physically, then we're just going to keep spinning in circles trying to and probably stay on medication or supplements for the rest of our lives trying to keep things in balance.
Interesting. So what happens with the theory, right? Like Dr. Vander Kolk saying when you're in when you have PTSD or if you have ongoing traumatic stress and you're constantly secreting all these hormones where your body is in fight, flight, or freeze mode, or now the fawn, add that in there too. Um, when you start treating your body, but you're not addressing the mental health aspect of it, then that's kind of doing a disservice to the whole process too.
Absolutely. There's a book by Gabor Mate called When the Body Says No. And he talks about what chronic stress does to the body and then the connection with autoimmune cancers, that there is a lot of connections between how a person handles their emotions and what comes up for them physically later on in life. It's so interesting that you can look back on some of these people that had really degenerative diseases and see like, wow, they were very people pleasing and didn't even know how to express their emotions or even recognize what was happening in their body. And then here's where this disease went. So, um, when we're not dealing with the entire person physically and emotionally, we're skipping steps. And
Fascinating. Sorry.
really, sorry, no, I could go on this forever, but that's really where I would start with people is like, let's start taking care of you physically, your sleep, your nutrition, getting some exercise, your screens, what are you doing to your brain? And then adding in the blood work has just been incredible to watch the changes.
It's almost, I'm like beating this with the, what's the saying, beating the dead horse or whatever, right? But it's just like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Because if you've gone through PTSD and a lot of stressors in your life, and now your body's all out of whack, and then
Mhm.
you're feeling certain ways, but what if it almost seems like maybe experiences and stress are first, and then they throw everything off, but then also when you're not addressing the imbalances that are caused because of stress, then it continues to perpetuate and exacerbate maybe some like depressive or anxious symptoms.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know because there's also the flip side of that where, if somebody is physically very ill, that can cause symptoms as well. If I've been
Yeah.
sick for many years, then I'm more likely to have depressive symptoms. And is that because of my physical issues, or is that just the drain of the stress?
Mm, that's so interesting. I'm like super fascinated by this because there's not a whole lot of people. I just did another EMDR advanced training recently, and they were asking like when someone treats their trauma, and let's say since you do EMDR, once they've done EMDR, do you notice a shift at all in the way the body is regulating all its hormones and how it's functioning?
Yes, I've had their sleep improves, they have more energy. There was this one, and I was still in my supervision for EMDR, or I guess I don't know if I should call it supervision, but working for my certification.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very new to EMDR, and I'd been working with this person for a really long time. And we did a processing session that was very good, and she had some really great breakthroughs in that session. And she came back the next time and looked completely different. Her face looked so different. And I was like, what is happening here? But the tightness in her face, she looked younger. That trauma had actually changed how she looked on the outside. It was incredible. And she's continuing to work. We weren't done, but it was just something that had been released during that session.
Ugh, those I love those. And then I also feel for my clients for those big ones because you're like, you might feel the lingering effects of this for a few days, like that emotional hangover as your
Yeah.
brain continues to, process it out. Um, Sleep improves. I want to touch base on sleep because that is such a common thing that people are like, I don't like, I
Mm.
struggle to sleep. I struggle to fall asleep. I struggle to stay asleep. Or once I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, then like all the things in my mind just keep me awake and I am up for the day. And so they get very minimal sleep. Um, and so, yeah, ideally you want people to improve their sleep, but at what point is it trauma or is there like certain hormones that cause people to lose sleep? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. I knew the answer to that one.
Okay.
Um, because your thyroid can affect that too. Your thyroid being off, if your estrogen and progesterone levels are off, testosterone, same thing. I mean, just it's just so the more that I get into this, the more I just everything is so incredibly connected.
Hmm.
And we we have separated everything so much that um I understand where, it can feel like I'm just running the hamster wheel here and I'm not getting anywhere and I'm doing all the things. Um, so a lot of times it ends up just kind of being, process of elimination. Let's go through this stuff and see what's going on. And, is this trauma related? Is this, lifestyle related? A lot of times, especially with my teens, like what time are you getting off of your phone and then what time are you laying down to go to bed and how close are those? Um, I had one client that like, they would read a math book when they would wake up in the middle because the habit was to get up and look at the phone. So some of those changes in habits make a huge difference. And then other times it's, vitamin D levels are off. So, I'm sleeping so much better in the summer and I can't get any sleep in the winter. And so many factors that I wish there was an easy answer that this thing being off, here's what we take care of so that you can get better sleep. But I tell people all the time when they come in, we're going to try a lot of things and we're going to,
Hmm.
what doesn't work. What works for me is not necessarily going to work for you. And the thing that I love about blood work is that that's pretty black and white. The numbers are there, or they're not. And then we know what we need to do to get the numbers in range.
So do you get your base level, right? Your CBC with differential. And yes, I know about the CBC with differential. When you have a kid with cancer, you
Oh,
literally
yeah.
know about the CBC with differential. But so you get your baseline basically, and then is it you're following up with labs like on a quarterly basis, every 6 months, once a year? How does that work for someone?
So, what I encourage people to do is when we go through their blood work and identify what's off and what needs to be taken care of, we develop a supplement plan. So, for a lot of people, that's about 6 months. For some people that have maybe, they've had something going on for 20 or more years, or it's very significant, then we'll spread it out for 12 months, or maybe they have a lot of sensitivities to supplements. We want to take it a little slower. Um, but for most, it's 6 months. So I really encourage them not to redo blood work until we've completed that 6 months, because the ranges can jump all over the place while we're healing. So um, the first 3 months really is most of the time about the gut. So we're clearing out the bad guys, putting the good guys back in, and getting the gut back into balance again. And then we'll move on to the next phase, whatever their blood work was showing. If they were to test again after those 3 months, their blood work would probably be, they might be a little freaked out by what that would show, because we're still in the middle of healing the process. So everything's pretty off.
Okay. Um, you mentioned the gut. Everyone talks about gut
Yeah,
health, gut health.
right.
And I'm just going to interject my own little personal story. So you're more than welcome to use me as a guinea pig if it even applies to illustrating this example in this question. But basically, I had to meet with a dietitian today and I literally threw a tantrum, like a full grown woman tantrum because and I opted to see a dietitian. I went and like I mentioned, I got my labs done this past week and my labs were like my cholesterol and all that stuff, it was bad. Vitamin D levels, bad. My cortisol levels, pretty low, like the whole shebang. I'm like, ugh. So he told me no carbs, no sugars, none of that for you right now. For at least a month, got to get on medicine. So I was like, dang it. I think it's time I go and talk to someone to at least learn how to eat and maybe some better behaviors and all that stuff. And I mean, this woman, she, God bless her. She literally, that's a Texas phrase, by the way. But she literally, she asked me, well, first she goes, so this is what we're going to do. We're going to work on, creating more of like a schedule where you eat breakfast and you have a snack and you eat another meal and have a snack. Does any of this feel uncomfortable for you? And I was like, yes. And she's like, okay, tell me more about that. And I'm like, I feel really like restricted and confined to somebody else's schedule. And I, like, with my trauma history, I feel powerless and out of control of my schedule now. And I know it's like supposed to be helpful, but just the idea of somebody else telling me how to do my meals every day, like, I was like in tears. I was like, I'm sorry. I was like, this is so silly, but it just like, it makes me feel out of control. And I'm like, I know that I need help, but anyway, so the whole idea of like that whole meeting, basically, she basically told me my hormones are clearly out of whack. So I'm craving more food. So I'm gaining the weight, right? Or not getting enough nutrients. So therefore it's making me choose different things and behave in different ways and have more anxiety and whatnot. So um she basically is talking about the gut health, but I'm like, what is the gut health? Right? Like
Yeah.
what does that mean? Like gut health. Everyone talks about it. And so what does that mean? And how do you help somebody reset that?
Okay. So there is something called a microbiome. This is probably a word that is getting out there a little bit more as well. And if you think about it as like the community of your gut, so this is the bacteria, the organisms, all that live in your gut all the time,
Mm-hmm.
or should be living in your gut all the time. And there's a lot of things that can throw that off. Stress can throw that off. Antibiotics can throw that off. And what I noticed with people that are more like my age and older, that was something, you get sick and you get antibiotics. Antibiotics were thrown
Mm-hmm.
at everything. So the gut health of people that grew up during that time is probably more off than say like my children who haven't really had antibiotics that often, because we know more about what can you do to take care of some of this stuff before it gets to that point. um, there's just so much information out there. But so really it's that balance of those organisms that are living in our gut and breaking down food and helping our body absorb things gets thrown off. So then the bad stuff, the bad bacteria is able to grow more. um, Sorry, I just got a call there. Um, and then when that happens, now we're not absorbing nutrients properly, which then throws everything else off because our body isn't able to absorb things properly. It's not taking in, it's not eliminating correctly. So we can't keep the rest of our body functioning well.
So you live in America.
Mhm.
We are all about convenience. So we got food, you know, fast food places like crazy around. And we live very busy lifestyles. Like we have kids who are in multiple sports and, it's like you're having to be 20 places at one time. And so meals don't get prioritized. Or you're like, well, let's just swing by and pick up something, from Chick-fil-A. Shout out to Chick-fil-A.
Yeah.
I'm not obsessed with them. um,
Be worse.
so do what?
There could be worse places.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, But so when we're eating junk food or craving sweets, and that becomes like the comfort, right? Like that's what we're used to. But then when we're upset about things, we're like, I'm gonna go get some ice cream, or I just need a chocolate bar or whatever, right? Like, um, how does that impact? I don't know if this is a good question for you or not, if you know how to answer this. But how does that impact the gut? And like, does that show up in our labs?
If it's that, I have a candy bar once a week or, I eat ice cream now and then, it's not going to likely have a huge impact unless there's some kind of a food sensitivity. Obviously, that's going to create a storm in there. But if it's something that I'm doing pretty regularly, we can get to levels of like, now I've created insulin resistance in my body because I've been taking in too much sugar. Um, and a lot of it, I think that there's just a misunderstanding of what is healthy and what is not. I just had somebody today. Well, there's no sugar in ice cream, right? Because they're trying to cut sugar. Yeah, there's a lot of sugar in ice cream.
Mhm.
So even just some of that education piece of what is good for you and what is not. But um, I mean, I even talk to people about as far as your nutrition, it's just trying to improve it a little bit because it is really, I don't know about you, but this is me. If somebody were to be like, you need to change your diet completely tomorrow, I likely wouldn't stick with it. I might do it because I'm trying to reach a goal, but to then continue it long term is very unlikely. But if I'm asked to make a small change, like I want you to increase your water intake to, right now you're drinking 32 ounces of water a day. I want you to increase it by 1 glass. So you're at 40 ounces a day. That's doable. That's not a big
Mhm.
deal. That because even if I didn't do it throughout the day, I can drink a glass of water before bed. So just asking people to change things a little bit at a time rather than flip everything at once. First of all, it gives them a little bit of control. So I talk with people about, what is doable for you? What can you actually change right now? Um, and a lot of people really like, unless there's food sensitivities, I don't typically ask people to completely change their diet when we're going through a plan. Um, we want to try to move towards a more healthy diet. Unfortunately, in America, eating healthy is expensive.
Oh, I
So,
know.
somebody on a fixed income to start buying organic or more fruits and vegetables or, whatever it is, it's a lot of money and the convenience foods are cheaper.
Yeah, that's really sad.
It is.
I watched this show. Oh, I can't even remember. It was on Amazon, and it was like this alternate world, something about the castle, something in the castle. But basically it's like this alternate world of like what would have been if Germany would have won World War II.
Mm.
And in there, I think it was this show that, or maybe not. I don't know. We're gonna go with it though. But basically the idea that um the world that we live in with all this addiction to sugar, it was basically saying like we're literally like poisoning ourselves. And it was like the idea, the plan, like let's keep you addicted to sugar. Let's keep all these foods that aren't satiating, like chips that are incredibly delicious, make you crave it a little more because of that, like the extra ingredients that they add to the food that are
Mm-hmm.
literally made to make you come back and buy more because they're creating an addiction, which in theory, you would think someone like me would be like, like, throw my fist up at them and put a few expletives in there because they're trying to control me. But no, I buy into it because I'm like, but they taste so good.
Yeah.
They're so delicious. Who needs gut health? Not
It's so
me.
break that feedback loop. Like this tastes good, then it feels good. I'm going to continue doing it. Even
Yes,
the destruction it creates later because that instant gratification is so powerful.
mm, it is so powerful. It was worth it until it wasn't worth it.
Right. Well, and the consequences, they don't show up right away. So
Hmm.
I'm eating a bag of chips, but I don't feel it immediately. I feel it, 5 years later when my cholesterol is high, or I have heart problems from all the sodium, or whatever. We don't, it can even take longer than that. And it's, when we live in a you only live once world and
Mhm.
do what makes you happy now, it's hard to break that.
I know last night. So I've been on this like red, clearly it's a diet right now, trying to get my body in a normal level. And last night, instead of having the typical like yogurt popsicle thing that we get from Costco, I walked into the bedroom with my husband because I was a little hungry. And so I had a handful of carrots and he was like, "What are you eating?" I was like, "Carrots." I don't know. This is what my world has come to. I'm snacking on carrots before I go to bed. It was actually pretty good.
Well, and I think it's something like it only takes 20 days or so for your body to adjust to that. I had a good friend actually who had some pretty significant food sensitivities and had to cut. I couldn't even believe when she gave me the list of stuff. I'm like, what are you going to eat? Um, but she said now, like, she doesn't even want some of that stuff. Like, it makes her sick thinking about eating some of those things because she's just gotten to this place of like, she's eating so incredibly healthy, which I admire her for because I don't know that I would have been able to do it. Um, but her body won't even, like, it almost rejects that stuff if she tries to eat it now.
That's interesting because I do feel like, I had this like, maybe it's just this whole week of grieving because I'm like, no carbs for just a month for right now. But realistically speaking, I'm one of those people, like, I probably am more on the compulsive side of eating. Like, I'm a binge eater. Um, Not with like, bulimia and all that stuff, but I do like, I consume crap food to the point at times where I feel like a little bit out of control. And so the idea of being one of those people to say, I'm just going to have one sweet for the week. Like that's to me, it's like a gateway drug. Like my husband and I had this conversation. I'm like, I could never do that. Like I've tried that many times. And every time I take one, then the next day I'm like, well, it's just a little bit. And then all of a sudden by the end of the week, I'm like, well, just go ahead and have that cookie at Chick-fil-A because they're stinking delicious. I'm like, so I just keep adding the sugar into all of my meals. And I'm like, I think I've just come to the realization that I can't do that, right? Like I don't know if I'll be able to go back to having um the things that are like my gateway drugs because I'm just really nervous about that slippery slope for me. And when your numbers look as bad as mine do, where the doctor was like, "Oh my gosh," he's like, "We got to
Yeah,
get your medicine stat,"
right.
you kind of realize like, and I'm a thin person, okay, so like I'm one of those people that looks thin on the outside, but obviously on the inside, I got sludge right in my gut.
Yeah.
I am not in optimal performance, so I'm curious to see what it'll pan out like for me as well, like with your friend, going through restricting her diet and really learning to eat healthy.
Mm.
So back to your friend, I promise I go off these little bunny trails and I'll bring you back. Um, but your friend having food sensitivities, I actually heard recently that when you have like a food sensitivity or allergen, that your body can actually crave it and then continue to wreak havoc in your system. Have you heard
Hmm.
that?
I have not heard that. That's so interesting. I wonder, I wonder if there's any connection to the emotional component of eating, especially if there's, going back to EMDR here, if there's unmet childhood needs. And this isn't to say that, the parents are terrible. I hope nobody
Mhm.
hears, but um, parents are humans and we get things wrong. And
Mhm.
uh, but then, food can kind of, in a way, unsatisfactorily meet the needs. So because of the chemicals that are released when we eat too, so then it can kind of be like that replacement, and it's like it's part of it, but I'm not really getting what I need. So then I have to keep going back to it. I don't know if that would have anything to do with it.
Like the dopamine hit. You're like,
Yeah,
this tastes so good. Dopamine. Yay. I feel happy
right.
for a second.
The
Um,
dopamine I would have got if somebody was like, oh, you're sad, I'm gonna hold you and rub your back and let you cry, and that would be a dopamine hit too. But if you're not getting that, or there can be definitely much more severe unmet needs there, but um all of it's dopamine. So
Interesting. Yeah, it's it also makes me think of all the times that in the movies, people say, "Oh, you went through a breakup. Let's go get a big gallon of ice cream and let's
mhm,
eat our emotions," right? And that's so normalized in
right.
our culture. And we're like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen as an adult. And then yet as a parent, there are times that I'm like, you're so sad. Do you want to go get an ice cream? I'm like, Adriana, you can't use food to like comfort your child or like bring up their mood, right? Like you've got to learn to like let them sit with the emotion. But
Yeah.
you know how many parents do that? I know I'm not the only one.
Oh, no, you're not. No, I've for sure done that. Yeah, here's a sucker.
You just got a shot, take a sucker.
Yeah, right. Sugar heals pain. I mean, even, like I have boys, so even in the hospital, they give kids a pacifier with sugar when they do
Yes.
circumcision.
Yeah.
So it's from, whatever, 2 days after birth, that that's a remedy for pain. And what does that do to the brain?
Oh,
I don't
that's
know.
really interesting because so my mother had told me at one point that culturally, when um, I was born here in the US, I was born in Texas, and that she was advised instead of feeding me when I was hungry, like when babies cry, to feed me, that you could feed every X amount of hours. And if the child would cry in between that, just give them a bottle of water with sugar.
Mm, interesting.
So now I'm making these connections as to why I've been addicted to sugar my whole life.
Yeah,
Wait a
that's how
second.
you sing.
I'm like, wait a second. I'm going to have to talk to my therapist about this. This explains so much.
Yeah. And I mean, those are things that we wouldn't all be aware of, right? So unless you hadn't, you were able to have that conversation with your mom, but how many people was that the case for, and they didn't even know that they were soothed with sugar water?
It's, I'm going to blame it on my mama.
There you go. That's always like, oh,
That's always the go-to in the therapy world. It's always your
although
mom.
you would like someone else, so maybe blame it
No,
on the.
blame it on the doctor. That's right. Well, I'm curious, like, do you do coaching or do you only work therapy and blood work in conjunction with one another?
So I do. It's kind of a like either or both. So I have some people that we're just doing EMDR, because that's primarily what I do with everybody. So therapy, using EMDR, and then some people who are just doing blood work, and then some who are doing both. I'm actually working right now on a group program to do virtually, targeting sleep. So that it's not completed yet, but I'm hoping I'll have that up and running by the end of the summer here. Um, and then I do some virtual therapy.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the blood work, when it's just straight blood work, that's done virtually as well.
That's really amazing. I need to learn more about becoming a functional blood work specialist because I just think it's fascinating. And
Yeah.
I never knew that a therapist could do that. Like no one has ever said, "Hey, by the way, I'm a therapist and a functional blood work specialist. Let's do the two together."
Well, yeah, what happened to me was I had a friend who had actually the woman who trained me, she was working with my friend who had some pretty chronic health issues. And I was telling her about this, like, I'm so tired and I just feel like I could wake up and go back to sleep again and just sleep for days. And she's like, you have got to meet with Dr. Kylie. So I set up a meeting. I went through the plan with her and I couldn't even believe like there must have been something going on for me for most of my life because I have never, ever had that much energy in my entire life that I can remember. So I had seen that, she's training people on how to do this and read blood work. And so I had emailed her and like, oh, do you think that a counselor could do this? And she was like, oh my gosh, that would be so incredible. Could you imagine what you could do with people? Because she talks a lot about how this impacts your mood. And then I'm thinking about, I had this one client long before I even knew about functional medicine that came in and had been depressed his entire life and it just disappeared one day. He came in and I was like, what
Damn,
happened
you're
to
that
you?
great, huh?
It wasn't therapy. He'd only been seeing me for a couple of months. It was just, I'm like, what did you do? This is unbelievable. He had gotten on supplements and was healing his body. And it was such a transformation. I couldn't even believe it. I had never seen something like that before. So that was long before I ever got into this, but even just thinking about that, like what could this do for clients in transforming even how they're able to go through EMDR and manage the emotions that are coming up. And, when we think about how draining it is the next day and that they're still working
Yeah.
through these emotions, their body can tolerate it more because it's not under so much stress.
I am seriously going to be obsessed with this. Like it, when you talk about healing the person holistically, as therapists, like especially people who do EMDR, they just, I don't know, they function differently, right?
Yeah.
They just function differently. Um,
Yep.
but you're looking at the whole system and you're like, how are you eating? How are like your exercise? What are your relationships like with people? How are you doing at work? Like, how does how do your subconscious beliefs show up in your work environment, right? And
Mhm.
so looking at the whole picture, health wise, I've always kind of been like, well, yes, it's good to, make sure you're not suffering depression because of certain things, but um, I've never really looked at it as being able to be an active conduit participant in the labs. Like, what is that looking like? And let's get you on some supplements. So I'm totally gonna pick your brain outside of this. I'm gonna be like, please tell me more. Because that's
Yes.
really
I would love.
amazing. It's
Mhm.
amazing. I loved hearing everything that you've been able to like shed light on today. And I hope that the listeners are gonna go and get their labs done immediately and be like, oh my gosh, maybe this is why I'm struggling with anxiety, or be motivated by my no sugar kick, no
Yeah.
carbs.
That, I am impressed. That would be a hard one.
I mean, he literally said no pasta, no bread, no pasta, no rice, and no potatoes. I was like, sweet
Oh my goodness.
potatoes too? And he was like,
You live in
yeah, especially.
Texas.
Well, then my nutritionist, I'm like, I can't even talk. My nutritionist that I spoke with today was like, when things like this happen, they can also kind of create and perpetuate that feeling of being limited and creating further like binge type issues in the
Mm.
future. So with this one for me, I'm like, I don't think my body hates me right now. I'm like, my body's pretty pissed. So I don't know. We'll see. But um I don't even know where I was going with that. I'll be honest. I forgot. So,
That's all right.
um,
You know,
yeah. So I really appreciate your time and all of your knowledge and expertise. This is just fascinating. And I hope people get motivated to like look at their whole body, their whole
mm,
health, and start healing from the gut with what'd you call microns?
micro
Yeah, that. So,
balance.
yes. Thank you so much for joining me today, Jessica. I hope to have you back on at another time. So thank you so much for joining. And if anyone wants to learn more about your services, what is a good way that they can find out more about you through social media or website or any of that? How can they get a hold of you?
So I have my website that is www.pathtowardhealing.com. And that is where you can set up a consult and order supplements as well. Um, and just to kind of learn more information about your gut and the systems in your body and how they're interacting together and what could be causing your symptoms, I do have a Facebook page, and that is called Path Toward Healing as well.
Amazing. Okay. If I will post all of those links on the notes, the show notes. And thank you so much for joining me today. And thanks, audience, for joining and listening. And if you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of her or you know how to reach out to me. So I just appreciate you guys listening in today. You guys have a great one.